If someone had told me a few years ago that I'd see myself this way, I probably would have laughed and said they were exaggerating. I was always in control, or at least I thought I was. I knew how to play the game. Woke up at 5 a.m., went to the gym, had my protein smoothie, and spent the day in meetings at work. My colleagues thought I was living proof that dedication and effort pay off. I'm a 31-year-old woman with a successful career at a large financial consulting firm. My life seemed perfect to outsiders. I had my dream house, a beautiful luxury residence, in a sophisticated neighborhood with a wonderful city view. What more could anyone want, right? But the truth is, behind all the achievements, there was an enormous weight on me, something few could see. This weight didn't come from above, but from within my home. And even with all the good things in my life, I felt an emptiness I couldn't understand. When I looked at others, especially my family, I felt I wasn't being seen as the person I truly was, but as a resource, like an inexhaustible source of money and solutions. And the worst part, I could never rest. All my time, all my savings, were directed towards helping my parents. That dream I had, the house where I imagined spending the best years of my life, soon became a place of constant sacrifices. When my parents, Rodrigo and Marta, moved into my house, I knew it was a temporary situation. My father, who had always prided himself on being a hard-working man, was facing financial difficulties after a collapse in his construction business. They said they would soon get back on their feet, that it would just be a phase. But this just a phase stretched for years. Months passed, and instead of looking for a solution, they got comfortable. The just until we get stable turned into a reality I never imagined. My parents weren't contributing anything, while I carried the burden of paying for everything: the house financing, electricity bills, water, groceries, insurance, everything. And honestly, I never questioned it. I always told myself it was the right thing to do. After all, I was the responsible daughter, the successful one. It was my duty to take care of them. The thing is, at some point, things started to weigh heavily. It wasn't just the money anymore. It was the time. The time I spent trying to please them. The time I set aside to be with them, even when I knew what they really wanted wasn't my company, but my financial support. I was becoming a shadow of the person I truly wanted to be. And all of this slowly worsened. What started as help for them to overcome a crisis turned into an emotional demand that suffocated me. I remember a conversation I had with my friend Louisa, a longtime friend. She was always the person who made me think. She told me, "Anna, you're killing yourself for them. They're adults, Anna. They should take care of themselves. What you're doing isn't right." But I always dodged. I always replied, "But they're my parents, Louisa. What else can I do?" And deep down, I believed in that justification. It's what my mother always told me. "Daughter, you need to be the support for our family. You are our only hope." And I believed it. Until one day, everything changed. I had just left an amazing work meeting where I had closed a big contract for the company. I knew that represented another step in my professional ascent. Victoria, my boss, was super enthusiastic, telling me I was on the right track for a promotion. I was so excited. The job I loved, the validation I sought so much. I wanted to share this victory with my family, who always knew how much I had dedicated myself to achieving this. When I got home, all the cars were there. A common sight, I entered, expecting a pleasant surprise, but as I walked through the door, I heard something that paralyzed me. My father's tone of voice, which I knew so well, was clear and distinct, and he didn't know I was there. What he said, or rather, what he thought I wouldn't hear, would change my life forever. I stopped in the hallway, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to hear anymore, but I couldn't avoid it. What he was saying wasn't just about me, but about our entire family relationship. He said in a cold, almost contemptuous tone that I was a failure. That, despite all the money I earned, I didn't have a real life, didn't have a family, and that everything I did seemed pathetic in his eyes. And, as if that weren't enough, he went on to say that true fulfillment lay in a simple life, like my sister Beatrice's, who had married young and already had children. I couldn't believe it. Every word felt like a blow. I was paralyzed. I didn't know if I wanted to scream or just break down in tears. But what shocked me most wasn't just what he said, but how comfortable he felt expressing it so openly. How he, who never had to do anything to help the household, who settled in while I worked myself to death to keep everything going, now felt entitled to criticize me. I didn't know what to do. A mixture of anger, sadness, and a sense of betrayal flooded my chest. And it was there, at that moment, that I made the decision to change everything. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I couldn't continue like this. And I want to know from you, what would you do? Would you do something immediately or wait for the right moment to act? I honestly didn't know what to do next, but something inside me said that the truth, however painful, needed to be heard. I didn't know what to do with the anger I felt. At that moment, I thought about confronting my father, yelling at him, but at the same time, I knew it wouldn't solve anything. I had already done so many things to try to please them, and most of the time, all I received in return was contempt or indifference. But at that instant, something in me began to change. Something that, until then, I didn't know existed within me. I no longer wanted to be the daughter who was always there, willing to sacrifice everything for those who never saw me as a human being, but as a money-making machine. I left home that day, not really knowing what to do, but I knew I needed to breathe. I went to Louisa's house. She always knew how to listen to me, without judgment, without asking questions. It was as if she were the only refuge where I still felt like myself. When she opened the door for me, it didn't take much for me to break down in her arms, of her. Pain and surprise were so great that I couldn't even organize my thoughts. I just wanted someone to tell me what to do. I was so lost. What my father had told me still echoed in my mind. The feeling of humiliation, of devaluation, consumed me. I had always been strong, always did what was expected of me, but deep down, I knew I was losing myself. The worst part is that until that moment, I didn't realize that the sacrifice I made wasn't just draining me physically, but emotionally, too. They had never asked me, never expressed guilt for depending on me. They just assumed it was my duty. And worse, I accepted that role. You don't realize, Anna, but you're putting yourself at the bottom of your priority list. What your parents are doing to you is emotional abuse. They're manipulating you, Louisa said, with that brutal honesty of hers that I so desperately needed. But you can't go on like this, you can't. They're slowly killing you, and you're letting them. These words stayed in my head for days. What do you mean, emotional abuse? I always saw what I did as an obligation, as an act of love, but was that really it? Was I really helping? Or was I just destroying myself to maintain a facade? I knew the answer, but I didn't want to face it. So I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that things could still get better. Who knows? If I kept doing things the way they wanted, if I just endured a little longer, maybe my father would change his mind. Maybe he would start to see how important I was to him. But the truth is, I knew that would never happen. It was when, one day after a work meeting where everyone praised my competence and vision, that I realized something terrible. Everything I did, however much I dedicated myself, wasn't enough for my parents. I was still that failure daughter, the one who didn't know how to be happy, the one who didn't know how to balance personal and professional life, the one who didn't have a husband, children, or a normal life like my sister Beatrice's. It was as if all my achievements were insignificant. Nothing I achieved would be recognized as a true victory, because for them, my life was always an extension of what they needed to survive. I was the key piece, the part of the gear that made everything work. Anger turned into sadness, and, more than that, into disappointment. I had sacrificed years of my life to live up to their expectations, to try to be who they wanted me to be. And, however much I tried to hide it, the frustration and sense of betrayal consumed me. I found myself reflecting on all the moments in my life when I had chosen to put them first, instead of myself. The trip to the Caribbean that I planned for years and had to cancel because my father asked for help with a home renovation. The Christmas party I spent alone because my mother didn't want to leave the house while my father was unwell. I had a life many people wanted. I worked at a big company, had my dream house, but I didn't have peace. I didn't have freedom. I lived in a vicious cycle where I could no longer see myself. And the truth is, I didn't want to be that person anymore. Not anymore. That's when I decided I needed a change. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew I couldn't continue in the same life. What I needed was a radical cut, something that would free me from the emotional prison I had built for myself. So, I started planning. I didn't know how, but I knew I would need to be strong. The first step was to think about leaving the house where it all began. Selling my house. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that if I didn't start, now I never would. I knew I would need courage, but above all, I needed freedom. And the only way to get that was to take control of my life, finally. I could no longer depend on their approval to be happy. That's when I decided to do the most difficult thing I could imagine, put the house up for sale. I didn't know how they would react, but I knew I couldn't continue living that way. With each step, fear and insecurity began to disappear, but guilt was always there too, circling my mind. I'm a daughter, it's my duty to help, I thought. But what I realized after so long is that their responsibility for their own lives was never mine. I didn't need to be the savior. I didn't need to sacrifice myself anymore. And, if you're thinking, and now, Anna, what are you going to do? Well, I made a decision. And you'll see how it changed everything. Because when you set out to change, when you start putting yourself first, life has a way of surprising you. I knew that deep down. I couldn't wait any longer. I had waited too long for changes that never came. I had given my family every chance, but it seemed I would never be enough for them, no matter how hard I tried. What hurt most, however, wasn't my father's veiled contempt, nor my mother's indirect criticisms. What truly gnawed at me was the fact that I no longer saw myself as the person who once dreamed of conquering the world. but as someone who had lost herself along the way, trying to please others. When I made the decision to put the house up for sale, a mixture of relief and dread took over me. I was relieved because I was finally doing something for myself, something that would give me a chance to be happy, but I also felt afraid. The fear of facing my parents, the fear of being seen as an ungrateful, selfish, heartless daughter. This fear had always been my biggest enemy, and for a moment, it almost made me turn back. But then I stopped and thought, what am I doing? For myself? And the answer was clear. Absolutely nothing. I couldn't continue in this cycle. The decision to sell the house wasn't just about getting rid of the financial burden. It was about getting rid of the emotional burden. Everything there reminded me of a time that no longer existed. When I first entered that house, I saw a bright future before me. I imagined it as the place where I would build my own memories, my own family. But instead, it turned into a prison, a constant reminder that I was on a path that wasn't mine. I no longer wanted to live there, surrounded by expectations that were never mine, waiting for something to magically change. I knew I would need courage to take the next step. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be fast. But I started researching how I could sell the house quickly. I called my lawyer and the real estate agent, starting the process. Each call, each meeting, was like cutting a piece of me that was anchored to that life I had tried to live for others. But what I didn't expect was the immediate impact. When my parents realized what I was doing, their reaction was devastating. I knew it would be difficult, but I didn't imagine the depth of denial and despair that followed. The fear in my mother's eyes, my father's disbelief. They didn't understand. They thought they were being wronged, that I was being unfair to them. "How can you do this to us, Anna?" my father said, his voice failing. And for a second, I almost felt guilty. But instead of giving in, I took a deep breath. I looked at them and thought of all the times I had put myself second. I thought about how much I had already done for them. And finally, I realized that none of this would make a difference if I didn't put myself first. It wasn't selfishness. It was survival. That's when I did what seemed impossible. I told them I was no longer willing to be the person who kept everything running, the person who sacrificed herself, while others sat back and waited. I had my life to live. I had to live for myself. The feeling of power that came with those words was something I never imagined I would experience. I didn't know that liberation would come in this way. I knew I needed to take that step. And that's what I did. Then, I started organizing everything. I hired a moving company, asked Louisa to help me decide what to take, what to sell, and what to leave behind. The house was put up for sale in a matter of days. I knew I had taken an irreversible step, but I also knew it was necessary. Even so, doubt still haunted me. Was I doing the right thing? Was I wrong for wanting to end this cycle? Was I being cruel? I asked myself that all the time. And then, one morning, when I was organizing my new life, I started talking to my boss, Raphael. He knew how focused I was on work and how much I dedicated myself to achieving my goals. And it was there that he asked me a simple question, but one that made all the difference. "Anna, have you ever thought about following another path? Not here, but somewhere else? I know you love your job, but is there something else out there for you? Something that might make you feel more alive?" Those words were loaded with something that until then I had never considered. I knew my job was important to me, but was it all I needed? I was so absorbed in work, trying to seek recognition and a promotion, that I didn't see I had lost contact with something more essential: myself. It was as if life had taken me in a direction I had never chosen. I was just following in the footsteps of someone I no longer knew who I was. What he suggested was more than a job change. It was a chance to start over, to give myself the freedom I sought so much. He suggested I go to Florianopolis, that I move to a smaller city, where quality of life was more important than titles, where the pressure wasn't so great, where I could rediscover who I truly was. And as he spoke, something inside me lit up. I knew that was it. It was the chance I needed to finally put myself first. I needed a fresh start, and I couldn't wait any longer. But before making any decision, I needed to organize everything. I needed to sell the house, deal with the pain of saying goodbye, and prepare for what would come next. However, I didn't know that the next conversation I would have with my mother would make me change my mind once again. And you won't believe what happened. When I put the house up for sale, I thought I had already made the most difficult decision of my life. But what was to come made me realize that, in fact, the biggest challenge would be facing my family. I knew that day would come, but I never imagined it would be so painful. After all, how do you tell your parents, the people who always told you that you were their only hope, that you're doing this not because you want to, but because you need to? That you can no longer carry this weight, this emotional burden, because, in the end, you are no longer willing to lose yourself to please them. I knew I was doing the right thing, but my heart still ached every time I imagined their reaction. And, in a way, I feared that, by making this decision, I would lose them forever. Of course, I knew I loved them, but what I feared most was losing myself, losing my dignity and my own happiness to try to maintain a relationship that never truly existed. On the day my mother called me for a serious conversation, my body was already tense. I knew it would be a difficult day, but I had no idea how devastating it would be. "Anna, we need to talk," she said with a serious expression, an expression I knew well, the one that always appeared when they needed to make me feel guilty. I took a deep breath, trying not to show how nervous I was. I knew I had to stay focused. I was already determined to move forward, to create a new path for myself, but still, the feeling of guilt was heavy. This is what happens when you've been raised to be the good daughter, the one who has no right to fail. They never told me that directly, but it was always clear to me. I had to be the responsible one, the one everyone could count on. "Are you going to do this to us, Anna?" My mother asked, trying to hide the pain in her voice but failing. "What do you mean you're going to sell the house? Everything you've achieved? You're going to throw it away?" I felt a pang of pain because deep down I knew my mother was saying that out of fear. Fear of losing what she had always had, what she had always expected from me. And deep down, I also knew that for her, this house represented more than just a building. It represented the continuity of a life she always wanted to keep intact, where nothing changed. But for me, this house no longer meant anything but prison. "It's not about the house, Mom." "It never was," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't carry all this anymore. I can't keep sacrificing my happiness, my life, my dreams, just to please you. I've tried every way. I've done everything I could, and it will never be enough. And I need something more. I need a future that is mine, that I build for myself." The silence that followed was heavy. I knew my words cut like knives. I didn't want to be cruel, but I also knew I needed to be sincere. The pain I felt was finally being released, but at the same time, it still hurt me. Deep down, I wanted them to understand. I wanted them to see me as I was, not as a source of resources. I wanted them to see me as the daughter who always tried to do her best, but who finally needed to put herself first. Anna, you can't do this to us. You can't just abandon us like this. She tried to approach me, as if it were possible to make me turn back, as if everything that was happening were just a phase, a momentary crisis. I pulled away. I'm not abandoning you, Mom. I'm just living my life. I need this. I can't continue with this weight anymore. I can't be the daughter who always sacrifices everything for you, while you keep expecting me to do more and more. At that moment, I saw something in my mother's eyes that I had never seen before, a kind of anger and frustration mixed with immense pain. It was as if she was understanding, once and for all, that what she expected from me would never be enough. She could no longer use me as the anchor she needed. I was letting go of the ropes, and that made her feel like she was losing control. So you're going to leave us here, alone, after everything we've done for you? After everything we've sacrificed? My father's voice rose. He entered the room and his presence was imposing, full of resentment. You're going to abandon your family? Everything we did for you? And this is how you repay us? I knew that would be his reaction. He always saw things that way. But what I didn't expect was for him to try to make me feel guilty again. He placed the blame on me as if I were responsible for all the failures and difficulties he and my mother had faced, as if it were my responsibility to keep everything running, even if it meant losing myself inside. But something inside me broke at that moment. I was no longer the daughter who accepted being the good girl. I was Anna, and I had the right to live my life. I had nothing left to prove to anyone. I can't be this anymore, Dad. I can't be the person who always tries to be everything for everyone, and in the end gets lost in the process. I'm tired of it. I'm not abandoning you. I'm freeing myself to be who I truly am, I said, with a voice firmer than I ever imagined having. There was a heavy silence. Our eyes met. And there, at that instant, something seemed to break. I was finally telling the truth I had hidden from myself for so long. I didn't know how everything would resolve from there, but I knew that by finally putting an end to it, I was starting something new, something of my own. I was no longer willing to be the perfect daughter. I was no longer willing to sacrifice myself for what others thought I should be. I was taking control of my life, and that, even though it was difficult, was the best thing I could have done. But, like any drastic change, this wouldn't be easy. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. And it was there, in that internal struggle, that I realized that perhaps I had made the most difficult decision of my life, and yet, also the most important. What would happen next? Well, you'll find out in the next chapter. And believe me, the next step will be even more difficult than I imagined. I remember how my life seemed to have frozen when I finally made the decision to sell the house, to distance myself from my family's expectations. It seemed like the whole world around me was still spinning, but I was on pause. I knew I had done the right thing, but the consequences of that decision were still unfolding. Every step, every action I took was like an exercise in renewal. I finally saw what I had been searching for so long: freedom. At first, it was a strange feeling. I had the sensation of floating, not really knowing where I was going. It wasn't like in the movies, where you turn the key and everything is immediately resolved. The truth is, deep down, I knew that the real work was just beginning. The change wasn't just physical, but something much deeper. I needed to rebuild my life from the inside out. The process of change was difficult, but necessary. I began to see the apartment I had rented in Florianopolis as a blank canvas, waiting to be filled. I knew I would have to restart my career and my personal life. When I moved, there was still a cloud of insecurity hanging over me. After all, selling the house and leaving the life I knew didn't mean everything would work out. But what I felt now was different. The insecurity came from the excitement of starting over. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was building something more authentic, more my own. That's when I started to see the little things, the ones I used to ignore. The sea breeze hitting the window of my new apartment, the smell of fresh coffee on quiet mornings in Florianopolis, the sound of waves breaking on the nearby beach. These small things began to take on immense meaning for me. I was no longer consumed by the exhaustion of trying to please others. I was breathing again. And that, in itself, was worth it. But despite this feeling of freedom, something still bothered me. I was so focused on finding my peace that I ended up forgetting about some people around me, like my sister, Beatrice. She was always the family darling, the one who had children early, who always had our parents' support. The relationship between us had always been complicated. Despite being in the same family, we never truly connected. There was always a distance, an invisible barrier that I didn't know how to break. I still didn't know what to do with my relationship with her, but I knew that if I didn't try, the distance would only increase. The problem is that when you live your whole life seeking the approval of others, even the closest relationships become a reflection of an unhealthy dynamic where you lose yourself in the role others impose on you. One day, Beatrice called me. She was trying to hide it, but the concern was clear in her voice. She knew I had changed a lot, but until that moment, she didn't know how much. "Anna, I'm worried about you," she said, and her trembling voice made me pause for a moment. "You've been distancing yourself from everyone, and I know you've been through a lot. I just wanted to know how you are." I realized that, until then, I had never given my sister a chance to truly understand me. She was trying to see me in a more human, more sensitive way, but I always saw myself as someone who had no right to be vulnerable. I always thought I had to be too strong, that I couldn't show weakness to her or to anyone. "Anna, I know you haven't been talking much, but if you need anything, I'm here. I want to help." At that moment, the weight of what I was leaving behind hit me hard. I had done so much to free myself from my family's pressure, but was I leaving something more important behind? I didn't want to be an absent sister. I didn't want what was between us to be destroyed by the emotional distance that had formed over the years. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision to open my heart to her again. For a long time, I closed myself off to the people I loved most in a desperate effort to find my own identity. But perhaps that wasn't necessary. I still had the chance to rebuild everything. What I did next was something I never imagined myself capable of. I opened up to Beatrice, not with easy words or promises that everything would change overnight, but with an invitation for us both to try, together, to understand our own stories and our own feelings. I didn't know how that would happen, but I knew I had to try. In this new chapter of my life, I began to focus on creating new relationships from a healthier and more honest foundation. I was, finally, being true to myself. And it was in my work in Florianopolis that I saw the difference it made in my personal life, too. At the company where I started working, I felt real support. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about being the best and most competent at any cost. It was about being who I truly was and still having my worth recognized. There, I found people who not only respected me for my skills, but also for my character. The leadership I began to develop in this new job was more balanced, more centered. I knew I was on the right track, but don't be fooled. Not everything was resolved. It wouldn't be an easy journey. I would still have to deal with many of the ghosts of my past, including the estrangement from my parents. Even though I knew I had made the right choice, sometimes guilt still hit me. The weight of expectations, memories, and even the words I had heard sometimes made themselves present. But for the first time in my life, I was willing to bear that weight, because now I knew I was creating something more important, my own happiness. I also knew that my life in Florianopolis, my new life, was just the beginning. I didn't know where it would lead me, but I felt I was in control, finally. And that, however challenging, was all I needed. Looking back, I realized that selling the house and moving here was a turning point. But more important than that was the freedom I finally found within myself. I didn't just sell the house. I sold the expectations, the guilt, and the ghosts that haunted me. And the most difficult thing of all, I sold the idea that I needed to be a version of myself that didn't exist. Now, I'm starting to be who I really am. And if you're wondering how all this ended, I can tell you one thing. True freedom doesn't come from external changes, but from how you see yourself and place yourself in the world. I took control of my life and, with that, found the peace I sought so much. Now I want to know from you, if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you make a radical decision to finally live your own life? Or would you choose to continue in what is comfortable, but that, deep down, doesn't make you happy? I really want to know your opinion in the comments.